The Tonight Show studio hummed with its usual Thursday night energy as William Foster walked onto the stage, his weathered hands and quiet dignity reflecting 25 years of tending to both the departed and the living. At 68, William moved with the reverent composure of someone who had spent decades maintaining the peaceful sanctuary, where families came to remember and grieve, his gentle eyes holding depths of compassion from countless hours, witnessing profound expressions of human love and loss. Jimmy Fallon stood to greet him, immediately struck by William's serene presence and the spiritual calm cultivated through years of working where life and death intersect. William wore his best charcoal gray suit and carried a worn leather satchel that had accompanied him through thousands of days, caring for both graves and grievers. "William Foster, everyone," Jimmy announced as the audience applauded respectfully. "William just retired after 25 years working as head groundskeeper at Restwood Memorial Gardens in Portland, Oregon. William, welcome to the Tonight Show." William settled into the guest chair with practiced grace, offering the audience a gentle smile conveying both warmth and peaceful wisdom from years serving those in their most vulnerable moments. "Thank you for having me, Jimmy. This is certainly livelier than my usual Thursday routine of making sure every gravesite looks perfect for weekend visitors." The audience responded with respectful laughter, and Jimmy leaned forward with genuine appreciation for this man who had dedicated his career to one of society's most essential but often overlooked services. 25 years as a cemetery groundskeeper. That must have given you unique perspectives on life, loss, and how people process grief, Jimmy said. "I imagine you've witnessed some incredibly moving moments." William's expression grew thoughtful, and he placed a protective hand over his leather satchel. "You know, Jimmy, most people think groundskeeping at a cemetery is just about maintenance. Mowing grass, trimming hedges, keeping grounds beautiful, that's certainly crucial. But when you work where people process their deepest emotions, you witness something much more profound than landscaping." "What do you mean?" Jimmy prompted, sensing something deeper behind William's words. William was quiet for a moment, his eyes taking on the distant look of someone accessing 25 years of meaningful observations. When you spend days working among graves, you see people at their most raw, most honest. You witness grief in all its forms. Fresh, overwhelming sorrow of recent loss, quiet, persistent ache of long-term mourning, complicated emotions of unresolved relationships. The studio grew more attentive, the audience understanding this wasn't just going to be about cemetery maintenance, but about human compassion during humanity's most universal experience. About 3 years into working at Restwood, I started noticing patterns in how people visited graves, William began. Some visitors came with family members, finding comfort in shared remembrance, but others came alone, and you could see they were carrying their grief in complete isolation. William's eyes grew more focused as he recalled those observations. I'd see the same woman every Tuesday morning, sitting by her husband's grave for hours, crying quietly and talking to the headstone. Or I'd notice an elderly man who would visit his son's grave every Sunday after church, bringing fresh flowers and spending the entire afternoon there, clearly having nowhere else to go. Jimmy felt his chest tighten, beginning to understand the profound loneliness William must have witnessed daily. That's when I realized grief doesn't just affect the deceased and their immediate families. William continued, opening his satchel slightly. For many people, especially those isolated or elderly, cemetery visits become their primary social connection, their main outlet for processing loss. The audience listened in respectful silence, sensing they were about to hear something important about compassion and human connection. William pulled a small notebook from his satchel, its pages yellowed and filled with careful handwriting. "So, I started what I privately called my Grief Guardian program. I began paying attention to regular visitors who seemed to be struggling with isolation, who appeared to need additional support during their mourning process. He opened the notebook, revealing pages of names, dates, and detailed observations about visitor patterns and emotional states. I would note people who visited alone regularly, who seemed overwhelmed by grief, or who appeared to have no other support system for processing their loss. Jimmy looked at the notebook with growing amazement and deep respect. "William, what did you do to help these grieving visitors?" William's face showed humility and quiet pride. "Well, Jimmy, there are strict protocols about interacting with cemetery visitors. People come to grieve in peace, and staff are supposed to maintain respectful distance unless approached for assistance." He flipped through several pages. "But I realized there were ways to provide comfort that didn't violate people's privacy or the sacred nature of their visits. I developed invisible acts of care, gestures that would let people know someone was thinking of them without intruding on private grief moments." William's voice grew warmer as he explained his approach. "For the woman who visited her husband's grave every Tuesday, I started ensuring that section was always perfectly maintained. I'd plant seasonal flowers near his headstone, ensure grass was immaculately trimmed, and sometimes leave a small arrangement letting her know someone had been caring for the space." Jimmy felt tears beginning to form as he absorbed the thoughtful compassion of William's actions. "But that's not all," William continued, turning to another section. "I also started leaving comfort notes, small, anonymous messages I would place discreetly near grave sites where I observed people struggling with particularly difficult visits." He showed Jimmy examples of carefully handwritten notes on small paper. Nothing intrusive, just simple messages like, "Your loved one is remembered and honored," or "Grief shared is grief diminished. You are not alone in your sorrow." The studio audience was completely absorbed, many clearly moved by William's dedication to providing comfort to people in their most vulnerable moments. "How did people respond to these anonymous gestures?" Jimmy asked gently. William's expression grew tender with memory. "Oh, Jimmy, the responses were more powerful than I could have imagined. People would find these small tokens and break down in tears, not of sadness, but relief at knowing someone else recognized their pain and wanted to offer comfort." He selected a specific page from his notebook. The woman who visited her husband's grave started leaving her own notes in response. "Through these anonymous exchanges, I learned she had been married 53 years and had no children or close family to share her grief with." William's voice grew more emotional. "So I began tailoring care specifically to her situation. I researched her husband's life through cemetery records and discovered he had been a veteran and passionate gardener. I started planting his favorite flowers around the gravesite and left small American flags on appropriate memorial days." Jimmy was openly moved by the thoughtful personalization of William's care. "You essentially became a secret guardian for her grief process." "That's exactly what I became," William replied, tears forming in his eyes. "And not just for her, but for dozens of regular visitors who needed additional support during their mourning journey." He flipped through more pages, revealing extensive documentation of different visitors and their needs. "Over 25 years, I estimate I provided this invisible care for about 150 regular visitors. Each person had different needs, different grief patterns, different ways of processing loss." The studio was completely silent, everyone absorbed in William's profound ministry of comfort. "Can you tell us about some other people you helped?" Jimmy asked softly. William selected another section. There was Mr. Richardson, an elderly gentleman who visited his adult son's grave every Sunday. The son had died in a motorcycle accident, and Mr. Richardson would spend hours there, clearly tormented by guilt and regret. His voice grew softer. I learned from overhearing his conversations with the headstone that he felt responsible for his son's death because they had argued the day before the accident Mr. Richardson was eating himself alive with what ifs and if onlys. William found the relevant documentation. So I started researching grief counseling resources and would leave small anonymous notes with information about support groups for parents who had lost children. I'd include quotes about forgiveness and healing and phone numbers for counselors who specialized in complicated grief. Jimmy leaned forward with deep interest. Did your intervention help Mr. Richardson? 6 months later, I saw Mr. Richardson at the cemetery with another man, and their conversation indicated they were both part of a grief support group. William replied with satisfaction. Instead of spending visits consumed by guilt, Mr. Richardson was now bringing stories and memories to share with his son, talking about healing and acceptance. William's eyes grew moist with emotion. A year later, Mr. Richardson left a note at his son's grave that said, "Thank you to the angel who reminded me that love is stronger than regret." I knew that message was meant for whoever had been leaving the comfort notes. Jimmy wiped his eyes, clearly moved by the profound impact of William's anonymous care. William gestured toward his detailed records. I kept careful notes about each person's grief pattern, visiting schedule, apparent needs, and types of support that seemed most helpful. I also built relationships with local grief counselors, florists, and support organizations so I could provide appropriate resources. William's voice grew more passionate. What I discovered is that grief is incredibly isolating, especially for people without strong family or social support. Sometimes the smallest gesture, a perfectly maintained gravesite, a thoughtful note, a relevant resource, can be the difference between healing and despair. Jimmy was deeply moved by the sophistication and compassion of William's approach. Did any families or visitors ever figure out that you were behind these acts of care? William smiled with obvious warmth and slight mystery. I was very careful to maintain anonymity because I believed the care would be more powerful if people understood it came from pure compassion rather than obligation or recognition seeking. He paused, then continued with growing emotion. But after about 15 years, I started receiving thank you cards addressed to the guardian angel of Restwood, or the cemetery's secret caretaker. People had begun to realize someone at the cemetery was providing extraordinary care beyond normal groundskeeping duties. William pulled out a small box from his satchel filled with thank you cards, letters, and small gifts. These are expressions of gratitude I received over the years, from families who figured out someone was taking special care of their loved ones' resting places and their own grief processes. He selected one card and read carefully, "This is from the daughter of a woman I had been helping for several years." She wrote, "To whoever has been caring for my mother during her weekly visits to Dad's grave, thank you for being the answer to prayers we didn't know how to pray. Mom told us about the flowers, the notes, and the sense that someone understood her pain. You helped her heal in ways our family couldn't." The studio fell completely silent except for the sound of people quietly crying. Jimmy felt his throat tighten with emotion at the profound reach of William's ministry. "William," Jimmy said softly, "you didn't just maintain cemetery grounds for 25 years. You became a shepherd for the grieving, a guardian angel for people processing the most difficult experiences of their lives." William looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "Jimmy, I just did what felt right when I saw people suffering. I happened to be in a position where I could observe patterns of grief and respond with small acts of compassion that might provide comfort." He gestured toward his documentation and thank you notes. "But what I learned is that grief is a journey people don't have to walk alone. Sometimes all it takes is knowing someone else recognizes your pain and cares enough to offer support, even anonymously." William's voice grew more passionate. "Every person who visits a cemetery is dealing with loss, but they're also celebrating love. My job was to honor both the grief and the love by creating an environment where people could process emotions safely and feel supported in their journey toward healing. Jimmy turned to address the camera directly. Ladies and gentlemen, William Foster didn't just tend graves for 25 years. He tended to the living, providing comfort and hope to people during their darkest moments of loss and remembrance. As the segment continued, William shared more stories from his notebook and letter collection. He talked about helping a young mother who had lost a child, supporting a veteran who visited fallen comrades, and caring for elderly visitors who had outlived most of their social connections. You know, William told Jimmy, what I learned over 25 years is that cemeteries aren't just about death. They're about love that continues beyond death. My role was to help people honor that love and find ways to carry it forward in their own healing. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, William spent another hour with Jimmy, sharing more documentation and talking about his philosophy of grief support and anonymous compassion. In the weeks following William's appearance, cemeteries across the country began receiving inquiries about grief support programs and comfort care services for visitors. Many cemetery associations started implementing training for groundskeepers about recognizing signs of complicated grief and providing appropriate resources. The International Cemetery, Cremation and Funeral Association reached out to William to develop guidelines for cemetery staff who wanted to provide additional support for grieving visitors while maintaining appropriate boundaries and respect for privacy. 6 months later, William published a book titled Sacred Grounds, A Groundskeeper's Guide to Caring for the Grieving, sharing techniques for recognizing visitor needs, providing anonymous support, and creating cemetery environments that promote healing. A year after his appearance, William was invited to speak at the dedication of a new comfort garden at Restwood Memorial Gardens, a special area designed for contemplation and healing, funded by donations from grateful families whose grief had been eased by William's secret care. The garden included a plaque that read, "Dedicated to William Foster," who reminded us that grief shared is grief diminished, and that love continues to grow even in sacred spaces of remembrance. That Thursday night, when William Foster shared his story of caring for the grieving with millions of viewers, he reminded everyone that healing often comes through the smallest gestures of recognition and comfort, and that we all have opportunities to ease each other's pain through anonymous acts of compassion. His notebook full of visitor observations and his box of thank you letters became symbols of what's possible when one person decides that caring for the living is as important as respecting the dead, and that sometimes the most profound ministry happens not through words, but through quiet actions that remind people they are not alone in their journey through grief toward healing.